everyone, and welcome to my channel. For those who are new, my name is Sierra and I'm a certified health and weight loss coach with a background in psychology. So today we're going to talk about something a bit controversial, and that's how to calculate your ideal weight. I think it's controversial for obvious reasons. Weight loss is a very sensitive topic in general, and because of that, a lot of people discourage talking about weight loss altogether. Some people believe your weight shouldn't matter at all, like the health at every size and body positivity movements, while many others say people are just too different to make generalizations. Even most health and fitness professionals avoid making specific recommendations for this reason. And while I do agree with a lot of that, I don't think avoiding giving specifics altogether is very helpful either. Because whether you agree with it or not, there are many people who do care about their weight and do have weight loss goals. And if no one educated or responsible is giving healthy guidelines, then the only information people are going to have access to is going to come from less qualified sources. Or people will just be left to figure it out on their own, which can also backfire. This is something I actually struggled with at the beginning of my own weight loss journey. Even after reaching a healthy weight, I still didn't look how I wanted to. The issue had more to do with body composition than my weight, but because I didn't know that at the time, I just kept chasing a lower number on the scale. Eventually, I just ended up losing way too much weight, which resulted in a lot of health issues, such as muscle loss, losing my period, and actually developing pretty severe binge eating issues that lasted for several years. So in my opinion, not giving any sort of guideline at all can be just as damaging as giving guidelines that may be a bit too overgeneralized. When you're trying to set a healthy and realistic weight loss goal, you need some sort of reference point. And although I agree that we do need to be cautious while giving generalized advice, I also do think it's possible to still give generalized advice while also accounting for individual differences. So that's exactly what I'm going to do in this video. I'm going to walk you through a step-by-step process to figure out your ideal weight based on your unique body and goals. So let's look at what people currently use to classify weight and figure out weight loss goals. One of the most common guidelines, both in the medical field and just in general, is BMI. It's a simple calculation based on your height and your weight, and it's used to categorize you as either underweight, normal weight, overweight, or obese. And while BMI isn't completely useless, because it can still give you a rough idea of where you stand, it also has some major flaws. The biggest issue is that it doesn't account for muscle mass or body fat percentage. In other words, people can have the exact same BMI, but completely different body compositions. A really common example of this is people with a lot of muscle mass. Muscle weighs a lot, so they weigh a lot for their height, which can put them in the overweight or obese category, which obviously doesn't make sense considering how low body fat they are. Plus, BMI doesn't account for sex differences. So men and women are judged on the same scale despite having very different body compositions by default. Because of this, many people consider BMI to be outdated and suggest using body fat percentage instead. And generally speaking, I tend to agree with this, because body fat percentage is what most people actually care about. People want to look a certain way, not just hit a certain number on the scale. Unless you need to be a certain weight for a sport or activity, if you could look exactly how you wanted to but be 20 pounds heavier, you probably wouldn't care. So one of the main things we do want to figure out is your ideal body fat percentage. But here's where a lot of people go wrong again, because body fat percentage also isn't the only thing that matters. Just like how you can have the same BMI and look totally different, you can have the same body fat percentage and look totally different. And this largely comes down to differences in muscle mass. These two girls have roughly the same body fat percentage, but look totally different. And the reason why is because one has significantly more muscle. So that means there are actually two key factors we want to figure out: your ideal body fat percentage and your ideal amount of muscle mass. But here's the kind of interesting part. If you know these two things, your ideal body fat percentage and ideal amount of muscle mass, you can actually calculate your ideal body weight. And this is simply because weight is a natural byproduct of body composition. For example, if you wanted to be 20% body fat with 100 pounds of lean mass, that means you'd have to weigh exactly 125 pounds. There's simply no other body weight you could be and also have that combination. So in short, your ideal look will always come from a certain body composition, and that will always translate to a certain body weight. And this is where BMI can actually become useful again. Not as the determining factor, but as a reference point once you've factored in body fat percentage and muscle mass. So although BMI definitely isn't everything, if you do reach your quote-unquote ideal BMI and still don't look the way you want to, you can be pretty confident that the issue probably isn't your body weight, but rather something like muscle mass. You likely just have too much body fat and not enough muscle. And this is exactly what would have helped me when I was struggling with my own weight. Instead of continuously trying to lose weight in order to get rid of body fat, I could have simply stayed the same weight and focused on building some more muscle mass, which would have naturally reduced my body fat over time. Or at the very least, I would have had a more realistic goal weight in mind based on the body I actually wanted. So, how do we actually calculate ideal weight? We essentially just follow the same process I've been talking about. Start off by calculating your ideal body fat percentage and the amount of muscle you want to have, and from there you can calculate your ideal BMI and weight. And since everyone is different, we'll still have to adjust those numbers slightly based on a few individual factors, but I'll get to that at the end. So without further ado, let's start with figuring out your ideal body fat percentage. So of course, there's no perfect body fat percentage for everyone, but we do have some pretty well-established guidelines that can give us a really good starting point. One of the most common charts I see is from Ace Fitness. Now, there are actually two different body fat charts, one for men and one for women, and that's simply because, like I mentioned, men and women have very different body compositions by default. A man and woman can look like they have roughly the same body fat percentage, but the man's body fat percentage is going to be a lot lower. So because most of my audience is female, I'm simply going to be using the body fat chart for females. But if you're male, you can also do this. Just follow along with your equivalent body fat percentage. And once again, it's important to remember that everyone will be different, not just because people carry fat differently, but also because people just have different goals. But generally speaking, most people will want their body fat to land in the athletes or fitness category. Athletes, if you're more focused on aesthetics and performance, and fitness if you're more focused on health and fertility. And this is a really important distinction to make because aesthetics and health are not the same thing. You may love the way you look at a low body fat percentage, but this doesn't automatically make it healthier. And in fact, it can be very unhealthy to stay at low levels of body fat. That being said, I'm not here to tell you what's right or wrong, because frankly, there is no right or wrong. If you want to walk around super lean and genuinely don't mind the negative side effects, then you do you. But if I were to give a recommendation based on what I think is optimal, where you can be as lean as possible without sacrificing your health, I'd say the ideal body fat for most women is somewhere in the upper range of the athletes category, so roughly 17 to 20%. 17% might be more aesthetic, but 20% is probably better overall for health and hormones. Again, this definitely won't be perfect for everyone, but if your goal is to look your best and you don't know what to aim for, this is probably a really good starting point. In short, I think roughly 20% body fat is a really good balance between health and aesthetics for most women. So, step 2 is to figure out your ideal amount of muscle mass. And this step is a little bit trickier because unlike body fat percentage, there aren't many well-established guidelines that are used to quantify the amount of muscle mass you carry. The best tool I've come across is something called Fat-Free Mass Index, or FFMI, and it simply uses your height, weight, and body fat percentage to estimate the amount of muscle mass you carry. Most people who talk about FFMI also have some helpful charts that describe what different FFMI values represent, but honestly speaking, I find a lot of them to be pretty unhelpful, primarily because they're targeted at a male demographic, and also because they're based on something called normalized FFMI, which is supposed to account for differences in height. But without going into too much detail and making this video more complicated than it needs to be, I simply don't find normalized FFMI as helpful or as relevant for what people actually look like. So feel free to do your own research and come to your own conclusions. But from what I've seen, using normal FFMI values tends to be more accurate when predicting what people actually look like in real life. So based on those reasons, I actually created my own FFMI chart that is more geared towards women and more accurately reflects what women actually want to look like in real life. So according to my chart, an FFMI of 14 or less is considered weak or delicate. Basically, I wouldn't recommend anyone getting under 14. A value of 14 to 16 is considered average. 16 to 18 is considered athletic. 18 to 20 is considered muscular, and an FFMI of 20 or more would be really hard to achieve for a woman unless you're enhanced. And once again, this is exactly what explains the difference in appearance between normal models and fitness competitors. Most models fall into the average category, where most fitness competitors fall into the athlete or muscular category. And if I were to guess what most girls are aiming for, it's probably somewhere in the average to athletic range. Almost everyone wants to be fairly lean, but not everyone wants to carry a lot of muscle mass, especially females. Because this is a health and fitness channel, a lot of you watching probably do want to be on the more muscular side, but I still think that the majority of females tend not to prefer this look. They usually want some muscle, but usually it's just in specific areas, like the glutes. And it doesn't necessarily require a ton of muscle to get that lean and toned appearance most girls are looking for. So for that reason, if I had to give a general recommendation, I would say that most girls would probably be happiest with an FFMI of around 16. And if we are factoring health into the equation, I do think that having slightly more muscle is healthier. So I would say to aim for at least 16 rather than anything less. Again, you might wonder why I'm giving specific recommendations at all if everyone is so different, but the reason is because many people simply don't have any idea of how much muscle they want to carry. So if you don't know, aiming for a balance value is probably a really good place to start. So step 3. Now that we have ideal body fat percentage and the ideal amount of muscle you want to carry, we can figure out what BMI you'd have to be in order to achieve that body composition. And you can definitely do these calculations manually or play around with the online calculators until you get the values you're looking for. But thankfully for you, I already did these calculations, so you don't need to worry about that. And as you can see, based on my previous recommendations, which are to aim for roughly 20% body fat and an FFMI of at least 16, that would put your ideal BMI at roughly 20. So that means if I had to give a recommendation for what I believe to be the ideal BMI, based on achieving the best balance between health and aesthetics, I would guess it would be around 20. And again, not because a BMI of 20 is inherently better, but because if your body fat percentage and muscle mass are where they need to be, that's simply just where your BMI ends up. In other words, a BMI of 20 alone is not the goal, but if your body composition is on point, it naturally will just land there. And this might be controversial because people tend not to like specific numbers. But just remember, this is based on averages. So you may fall somewhere close to that, but you may not at all. That being said, if you do look at research on BMI and attractiveness, which might be even more controversial to bring up, but I'm gonna bring it up anyway, some research actually shows that the most attractive BMI is between 18 and 20. And based on what we discussed, I think that makes sense. Most females actually have very little muscle mass, so a lower BMI tends to align with a leaner look. So if you do have a decent amount of muscle mass, research does tend to align with the idea that a BMI of 20 is probably ideal for a lot of women. And from there, based on your specific height, you can figure out the weight that BMI translates to for you. And once again, you can use online calculators to do this, but if you don't want to do that, just look at the chart I created. So, for example, let's just say you are 5'4", you are aiming for a balanced body fat, but you actually want to have a little bit more muscle than average. You would just find your desired body fat and desired FFMI in the chart and see where they interact. So a body fat of 20% and an FFMI of 17, so athletic, would be a BMI of 21. So you can go down into the BMI chart, find your height, 5'4", and find what a BMI of 21 corresponds to in terms of weight, which is 122 pounds. So, based on your ideal body composition, your ideal weight will be roughly 122 pounds. Now for the next step, this is where we get into more individual differences. Because even though we've been working with averages, not everyone is going to fall exactly into these ranges. And one of the biggest factors that can shift your ideal weight is your frame size. So not the degree of fat or muscle you have, but your actual bone structure. Now frame size actually doesn't necessarily have a big impact on how you look. In other words, it's not going to dramatically impact your shape. For example, just think of a Barbie doll. Whether it's a tiny Barbie doll or a big Barbie doll, the proportions are going to look the same. So don't think that having a larger frame size is a bad thing. If anything, it's even better because you can look the same way at a higher weight, which, if you don't know, can allow you to eat a lot more food. So although frame size doesn't impact your shape, it will impact the number on the scale. People with smaller frame sizes will likely have to weigh a little bit less to look the same, and people with larger frame sizes will have to weigh a bit more to look the same. And there's definitely no hard and fast rule for determining your frame size. It's actually very difficult to quantify, but often it's pretty intuitive. Some cultures are known for having smaller frame sizes, but of course it can vary within cultures as well. So a simple trick that you can use is the wrist test. Essentially, you just take your middle finger and your thumb, wrap them around your wrist. If your fingers overlap, especially if they overlap significantly, you most likely have a smaller frame size. If your fingers just touch, you probably have a medium frame size. And if your fingers don't touch, you might have a larger frame size. And based on that, you can slightly adjust your ideal weight goal. So if you have a really small frame size, you might want to subtract 5 to 10 pounds from your goal weight. And if you have a really large frame size, you might want to add 5 to 10 pounds. As you can see, my fingers slightly overlap, but not significantly. So my ideal weight might be a little bit lower than the average, but likely not by much. Once again, it's not gonna be completely accurate and is not something you need to stress about too much, but it's just something to keep in mind. Now, for the final step, this is where things get a little bit more nuanced. Everything I've shared so far is based on general guidelines and what's considered aesthetically ideal, but at the end of the day, your ideal weight definitely isn't just about how you look. It's also about how you feel, how your body functions, and what you individually value. And the sometimes harsh truth is, some people simply function better at lower body fat percentages, while others might experience significant health consequences if they try and get too lean. For example, when I get too lean, I actually lose my period. So even if I want to be super lean, I've had to accept that it does come at a cost for me personally. And once again, I'm not saying that you can't choose to be lean if that's the case. There is no right or wrong approach. But what it does mean is that you will have to weigh the pros and cons. You have to think about if the aesthetic look you're after is worth the negative consequences, or if the physical and mental trade-offs are too high. Only you can make that decision, and it should be based on your values, goals, and overall well-being, not what anyone else says you should do. And it's also something that can change over time depending on your unique situation. Just say you're trying to get pregnant, or you're trying to optimize your hormones. Staying in that super lean body fat range definitely isn't going to be ideal. That may be a goal for you down the line, but it doesn't necessarily have to be what you're aiming for right now. So, moral of the story, always consider your own individual goals, values, and psychology when making important decisions about your health and your body. And that's simply all there is to it. But like most things I talk about, the conversation doesn't necessarily stop there. You may still have certain questions, because even with your ideal body fat percentage and ideal amount of muscle mass, you still may not look the way you want to. And that's because there are still other factors at play, such as where you're carrying your muscle and where you tend to distribute fat. So how do these variables factor into calculating your ideal weight? Another thing you might keep in mind is that your ideal weight is not one single fixed number. No one's weight stays exactly the same every single day. So how do we navigate that? If your ideal weight is actually a range, what range should that be? And how do you adjust your plan to ensure you stay within that range? And lastly, even if you do know your aesthetic goals, how do you actually achieve them? It goes without saying that weight loss is easier said than done. And like I said, even if you do achieve your ideal weight, you may not have your ideal body composition yet. So what do you do if that's the case? Should you stay the same weight and attempt a body recomposition? Or should you try bulking and cutting phases? These are all really important questions to ask. And although they are beyond the scope of this video, it's still really important to keep those things in mind. This video was not meant to be a one-size-fits-all formula, and it's not going to answer every single one of your questions, but it should give you a really solid starting point. Another very important thing to keep in mind, as always, is that achieving your health and weight loss goals takes time. And it can be a very sensitive topic for a lot of people, especially if it's something you've been struggling with for a long time. So it's okay if things feel overwhelming or confusing. The most important thing is to approach it with patience and self-compassion. And if you are in need of more guidance, structure, and support, that's exactly what my health coaching services are here for. My goal isn't just to help you achieve your ideal weight, but also provide you with the knowledge, skills, and resources you need in order to maintain your results for the rest of your life. So if that's something you're interested in, definitely don't hesitate to check out my website, shoot me an email, or reach out to me on Instagram. Or at the very least, make sure to stay tuned for my future videos where I cover all these topics in a lot more detail. And with that out of the way, I'd like to thank you all so much for watching. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to my channel so you never miss any of my future videos. See you guys soon!